So I grew up in Clarksville, Arkansas. We moved there in 1952 so my dad could run a poultry hatchery. He'd run one in Humboldt, Iowa, where I was born, but he was in the National Guard and he got called up during the Korean War. So he was gone, and we had to move to what had been an abandoned farmhouse. And just before we moved there, my grandmother that lived with us since I was born passed away, and then my mother's brother died. So her family was pretty well gone, and Dad was gone, and I started thinking of myself as a grown person. And we were near the edge of town, so we could go outdoors. We got bikes. We could ride 5 miles out to Kings Canyon. A lot of fun outdoor stuff. My parents thought that Cub Scouts was a good idea, but there wasn't any in Clarksville, so they helped start it. My mom was a den mother. My dad was the first Cub master, and I really enjoyed scouting. I liked the fact that there were achievements and electives, and I moved into Boy Scouts, and the motto "Be Prepared" was there. And I guess it turns out I was preparing by my science stuff, by having a telescope, having a microscope, having a shortwave radio that I could listen to people from all over the world. And then one of the books that I read, I liked the Robert Heinlein juvenile books, and one of those was a book called Have Spacesuit Will Travel, which was a play on the Western TV show Have Gun Will Travel. I think I still carry that book with me because in it, the boy that's the hero wants to go to the moon. It's a time that there's a moon base, and he really wants to go to the moon. But his family doesn't have a lot of money. He has an opportunity to enter a contest to collect coupons, invent slogans, and if you win, you go to the moon. And instead of going to the moon, he wins an old spacesuit, which he fixes up, makes really, really neat and usable, and is going to sell it to fund going to college. And he decides to take it out for a walk. So he's out walking in a field with the spacesuit working order, and he hears something on the radio, and it's a flying saucer. And he directs the flying saucer down and gets taken prisoner in it, and a lot of adventures happen. But the key thing to me was he had the spacesuit. He was in the field. He was prepared, and then that was a junction point. Things could happen. And so I guess I carried that idea with me from then, that you were collecting experiences, collecting skills, and then anything could happen. I'd been around hatcheries since I was 2, and I started working in them summers when I was 12. And I did a lot of the just dirty work, putting eggs into incubators, taking chicks out of the hatchers, and putting them out so they could be counted and vaccinated. In 1962, the company that Dad worked for went broke. Then he got a new job opening a hatchery in Fort Smith, and we moved to Fort Smith, which was great to me. It was a bigger school, a lot harder math and science courses, and but the pattern that had been there in Clarksville, where I was at the top of the class in a class of 60, I was still at the top of the class in a class of 600, which made me kind of think, what did I need to do to challenge myself to see what I was capable of? So I worked in the hatchery summers in Fort Smith too, and graduated in 64, and was a merit scholar. In those days, Arkansas colleges didn't do very well with scholarships, and I needed to be either working my way through college or not expecting a lot of family support, because my parents both had some medical problems those years too. So I was real fortunate. I got a merit scholarship to Michigan State, and I could go there with 400 other merit scholars. They had more merit scholars than Harvard and Yale. So it was a good chance to see how well I did there. And Michigan State's where I got introduced to computers, not totally by my choice. I'd only seen a computer once when I went to college, before I went to college. That was during a science fair at Fayetteville. I got to see their IBM 7090 through a glass window. And that was my exposure to computers. So first year in college, my advisor told me I had to take a computer course. And it was a Fortran course, and everybody in engineering had to take it. I said, why do I need to take computers? I won't see one after I leave college. And he laughed at me and told me I had to take it. And it was an introduction to Fortran, using it for engineering calculations with a project in each of the engineering fields that they had a degree in. And the departments all presented to us, and the one that caught my attention that seemed most interesting to me was agricultural engineering, which I guess ties in with the hatchery work and all of the science and math stuff I'd done before. And it was the only branch of engineering that also used biology, which was interesting to me. So I took that course, learned Fortran, had that down, and then my next semester, I had a hole in my schedule, and I needed a 3-credit course, and my advisor suggested that there was one more computer course, Electrical Engineering 400, and I could take that. So I took that, and that was a real introduction to a lot of things. We learned about how computers really work inside. We learned a little bit about registers and accumulators and binary arithmetic and hexadecimal and octal, and played with those. And then after that, it was just a variety of things. We got to play with interfacing a device to a computer. We had a plotter, and we got to play with lifting the pen programmatically and drawing lines and making the device work. And we also worked with a paper tape programmable typewriter, and worked on that. And that was interesting and different. Worked with an analog computer, but the kind of fun thing we did at the end of it was there was a program for the computer called linear programming that could optimize things, low cost, other kinds of optimization. And our problem was to put in the nutritional content of breakfast cereals and formulate a complete human diet based on whether you mix Cheerios or Wheaties or Raisin Bran and what proportions. And that was kind of fun. So I started at Michigan State in the fall of '64, took that second computer course in the spring of 1965, and then used Fortran programming and a lot of engineering courses after that. I was in the Honors College at Michigan State, and the program I was in was actually called Engineering for International Service. I was going to take enough courses to get an engineering degree, and then I was going to get a liberal arts degree too. And that was one of the things that pleased me about Michigan State, was I could do that. So I was taking other things. It was in the Honors College, and the Honors College put out a bulletin of courses you could take. And I saw one that for some reason interested me. It was a course in Rhodesian history. That was the time of the Rhodesia declaring independence unilaterally, and it was kind of an interesting period. And the fine print said to get in this course, you need to be a junior or senior in African history, or have African history courses, or have had field work in Africa. And I didn't have any of those, but I called the professor and told him I'm an engineering sophomore don't have any of that, but your course sounds interesting. And he says, okay, you can take it. And so I took the African history course, and then that made me aware that there was an opportunity to study in Africa, that Michigan State had a program at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, and you could go there for a summer, and all expenses paid while you were there. Get 6 credits for the summer. So I signed up for that, and it meant I wasn't going to work at the hatchery. I wasn't going to make money. I ended up working at the hatchery 1 month of the summer. So I had to take out a student loan and talk about that with my dad. Why was this important? And it was important because I'd been subscribed to National Geographic since I was 13. I really thought I wanted to be out and see the world and do engineering stuff in the world. So this was a chance to do that. So I did that summer, went in a shy guy, one of the younger people, ended up being the MC of our program that we did at the end of the summer. And that gave me new kinds of confidence in myself. After my junior year, 1967, I thought I was going to get a job in engineering with the Soil and Water Conservation Service, and they waited till something like April or May to tell me that the job wasn't there. I didn't have a job, so it was going to be back to the hatchery at minimum wage for that summer. But I called home to tell my dad that, and he said, "Do you know Fortran?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "There's a thing called linear programming, the breakfast cereals. Do you know that?" "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, they're looking for somebody at the headquarters of OK Industries. They're getting a computer. They're going to use it to formulate feed and do accounting stuff. The machine uses linear programming for the feed formulation, and it's a Fortran machine." So I worked that summer of 1967 at OK, and learned a lot, and really got into computers. And one of the things was the IBM program to formulate the feed. It was good in calculation, but it was arranged more for a scientist. It came out with 30 pages of all kinds of weird ratios and information, and you had to dig through them to figure out what the real formula for the feed was. And IBM said there was no other way to change it. You couldn't get the 1-page report that the feed mill really wanted. So I figured out a hack. I figured out there was a bit switch you could flip, and instead of the output going to the printer, it went to a card punch. And I could take the cards from the card punch, run them through, and produce a 1-page report. So that was probably pretty important in that it convinced me that I might figure out how to do something that IBM said you couldn't do. I graduated from college in '68, got my bachelor's degree, and I got my draft notice at the same time. Army experience was a real important and interesting time in my life. But some jokers say that in the Army you have a good ferry and a bad ferry. My first year or so, I had the bad ferry. The Army, I got through basic training, but I had to get special made shoes, so it was delayed. I got out of that, went to radio code school, which was wonderful. But I got kicked out because the Army had lost my security papers, and you couldn't go any further. And my security papers got lost a couple of times, and I had told them I could type 40 words a minute, so they sent me to clerk school instead of training me as a gunner on an armored personnel carrier. And I got through the clerk school, couldn't ship any place because I didn't have a security clearance. So I've got some experience as a clerk there. If you'd asked me before the Army, what were the two things that I would most hate to do, one of them was being a clerk. And I found out I enjoyed some parts of that, working with the people. I got a guy out of the Army on a medical discharge. Had a lot of good times. And then eventually, the other thing I said I would hate was accounting, and the Army sent me to accounting school, and I became an accountant, and ended up at the top of that class. So I got a couple of promotions. So I was a Spec 4 by the time I was done with that, and was going to ship to Vietnam. And then the Good Ferry came in, and they canceled my orders to Vietnam the day that we were getting on the bus. And instead, I did carpentry work for a month, and a few other things about the time of the moon landing. That was the period of the first moon landing. And then I got shipped to Germany. And being sent to Germany was a great thing. I liked that. I was going to get to see more new countries. I hoped. In the accounting school, they told us there were two things that they weren't going to teach us because we wouldn't need them. And that was cost accounting and budgetary accounting. And I got into Europe, processed in Heidelberg at the Personnel Center, and they sent me to the Theater Army Support Command, who sent me to the Army Material Command. And the job I ended up with, I was the chief budget analyst for the Material Command in Europe. And I got in the office. There was a person in a captain and a Spec 5 and a civilian, and they were going to do the next budget, which was due in a month. What they didn't tell me was they were leaving in 2 weeks. And so I and a guy that was even newer than me, Jim Caldwell from Shreveport, ended up doing this budget in 2 weeks with very little background. And I found out I was in the captain's position. I was in an officer position as a draftee. And to add to it, just about the time they left, the ratio, the exchange rate between the German mark and the dollar changed. And that had not happened for 10, 20 years. So there was a new part of the budget, because part of our budget was in German money, part was in US dollars. And Jim and I figured out how to do it. But the headquarters above us said we were doing it wrong. And somehow we convinced our boss that we were right, and all these people with 20 years of experience were wrong. And it turned out we were right. And the top headquarters in Heidelberg eventually sent us to the headquarters that had told us we were wrong, to give them a class in how to do budgets, which was another one of these things that, so sometimes you might be right, even though people that are more important say you're not. Got out of the Army. The Army had convinced me that I liked more kinds of problems than I thought I did. The accounting problems, office problems were just as interesting as engineering problems. And so I switched. I had been going to go to grad school in meteorology, and I switched to operations research and went to MIT, and got there and found out that the professor that I was going to work with had written me really nice letters about thermodynamics and biology and a whole bunch of things, knew no more about it than I did, and had no budget for research. And so I ended up falling back to linear programming, and I did an analysis of human diets around the world and the implications of the staple crops for how you would improve those diets. And got my master's degree in a year, and decided that I needed to try to find a job, that I wasn't going to go get a doctorate without finding out if anybody found the stuff I was doing useful. I looked for jobs and had applied to 70 some of them, and got finally to the point where I figured anything with computers I could do. So I came to Little Rock and started calling people out of the Yellow Pages. And I got a place on someplace on 4th Street, I think, that was willing to talk to me. I went in, he talked to me for 10 minutes, and he said, well, I'm really sorry because I just really wanted to see what somebody that had gone to MIT looked like. And I don't really have a job. And I was pretty disappointed. And he said, but there's some people down the street, and I think they're hiring. They're on Victory. That's systematics. So I went in and ended up getting the job there. May of 1972, I got the job at Systematics, started the 1st of June. They programmed in COBOL. I didn't know COBOL. So I had 3 days to learn COBOL, and then I was expected to write 2 reports a day for a credit card system. And I was also expected to learn mainframe assembler and write what was called a central information file scrub program where they were trying to link together all the accounts that somebody had. And it was kind of like a early version of artificial intelligence. How do you figure out that slightly different spellings of name are the same person, that 2 people at the same address might be a family, and so forth. So I got right into COBOL, right into assembler, and then we finished the credit card system by the end of June and started an installment loan system. So my accounting stuff helped me understand all those systems, and it was kind of fun. I was enjoying that, and turned out that the assembler was really important. The Systematics was trying to run fairly large banks on fairly small IBM mainframes and write these new systems. And so our goal was to write the systems where they'd run in 32K of memory. That's 32K, not megabytes. And part of how you did that was by overlaying code, by having multiple pieces of the program broken out where you could load them. So we had to write assembler code to facilitate that, to make the main program call lots of subroutines and really think through how to do that. And then we got through by the fall of 72. They had a savings system done, a credit card system done, installment loan system done. Some other people were starting CD system. I did a check processing system that was modifying a bunch of IBM assembler code. So more assembler, more. And the first time I ever worked with interrupts, where the hardware has to tell a program, we need attention right now, and pop out of the program that you're in and go do something else. And so I learned a lot. And someplace in there, I was told I was going to write a financial management system for Systematics. And my specs were sales literature from 2 or 3 other companies that wrote bank financial management systems. MSA was one of them. And I was told, see this place where they check all their features? We need to be able to say we have all those features. And beyond that, I had Hunter Gamble, who was the head of sales, gave me about a 1x2 torn off piece of notebook paper, and it had on it responsibility center reporting, budgeting, and cost accounting. And I didn't mention, I think earlier, I had ended up doing a cost accounting project in the Army too. So knew just a little bit about those. And that was my specs, and I was supposed to write something. And so I did. Before we got it written, they wanted to sell it. So I ended up getting called in since nobody else knew anything about it. And I found I like talking to people and selling them software. I enjoyed that process. And We did FMS. We got it out, installed it with a lot of effort. Found I was sometimes working 300-hour months, and that reminded me of when I was in the Army. I worked 18-hour days sometimes, and my boss in the Army, Mr. York, the guy that had trusted me in my approach to the budget, said, John, if you're going to work 18-hour days, you should really be working for yourself. And you might want to think about starting a company. And that idea kind of carried forward. And the FMS experience was somewhat the same thing. I just was a guy that was going to work however many hours it took to make things work. So then several things happened in the next couple of years at Systematics. In 73 and 74. We got FMS going. I started designing and writing a commercial loan system, and that was going pretty well. But I saw that the company was not interested in selling software. They were interested in facilities management work, in running data centers for banks. And the people that were getting promoted or that were coming out of the development group were going into operations, people like Drew Kelso and Collins Andrews eventually. And I wasn't really very interested in operations. And I could see that we were about to end the main development phase and have this whole family of financial systems. And I'd kind of helped with some of the marketing literature and the view of how everything we were doing fit together. So for me, I wasn't really that excited about what was going to be my job going forward. And to make things clearer, there was a period in there where I thought I was going to be engaged, and that part of my life was going to be settled. And I had a pretty messy breakup. So I had I paid off my student loans, I paid off my car, I saved money, I had $6,000 in the bank, and no other responsibilities. And it seemed like if I was ever going to try this thing of starting a company, I should. And I'd asked a lot of questions at Systematics. Hunter had told me lots about the sales end of it and his view of how Systematics came together. Walter Smiley was still pretty accessible. I should have mentioned I was employee number 59. So Systematics was a few dozen people, but in that period it grew to a few hundred people and data centers from coast to coast and from the Gulf to the Canadian border. So it had become a really fairly large company and was now one of the top 3 or 4 banking software companies at the time. And I had more questions for Walter, and he doesn't remember it this way, but in one of those sessions, he said, John, the only way you get answers to those questions is try starting your own company. And so in the fall of 75, I did what I now would call customer discovery. I went back and I talked to the CEO of OK Industries and some other people about whether you could make a company out of writing programs for people. That there were new mini computers coming out, and there was a shortage of people able to make them do useful things. And Collier Windrith, who was the CEO of OK Industries, said, well, yeah, you could, and better. I've got a 6-month project right here. In August of 75, I quit my job at Systematics, and I knew that the OK income would last me for 6 months. I had a 6-month runway plus my $6,000, and so I started doing other calls. And I think a combination of I got directed at weird things. Systematics sent a couple projects my way because they were too weird for them, and they kind of thought maybe they were just weird enough for me. And I talked to a bunch of vendors that had nobody to write the code. So I think the first 7 people I talked to, I closed business with, which would never happen again. In August, September, and October of 1975, what was called Chamberlin Consulting was just me. By the time we got the Heart Seed Company business and the VA business in process, that was too much for me. And a high school friend who had been a programmer, Mike Bennett, came in with me. And Mike was just recently married. And so his wife, Noreen, even though she wasn't on the payroll, she came and she did various things for us. So Chamberlain Consulting rolled along that Christmas. Another high school friend, we were all in the Northside Band together. Bruce Knox heard everything that Mike and I were doing. And at the time he was in Michigan working for Whirlpool. He had an MBA, and he couldn't stand it. So February he came down to visit and convince his wife that they should move back to Little Rock and give up a good job and go to this chancy thing called Chamberlin Consulting. And then that a little later that spring, we changed the name. We incorporated it as Arkansas Systems. And Jim Wilkins, who had been the systematics lawyer, was the only lawyer I knew. He was at the Rose Law Firm. And I told him we wanted to incorporate. And he thought it was a crazy idea. So he did it, but he only charged us $50. We did a lot of business with them. He was our lawyer, and Hillary Rodham was our lawyer from the Rose Law Firm. But by spring of '76, we were incorporated as Arkansas Systems. We had a bunch of customers, and we hired a couple more people. We hired a guy that I had done a COBOL course over the winter, and we hired a guy named Bill Nunley from that. And then we hired Eugene Jones, who stayed with us forever. Christmas of '76, Bruce had a brother-in-law, James Hendren, and James got enamored of our company too. He thought it was pretty neat that we had a company of our own. We were doing all this interesting stuff. He was working for SAI and was doing the anti-missile defense system installations up in North Dakota. But he decided then in the spring of '77 to come along and was able to start spelling me on the VA project. And I was able to get married. I'd be gone for a week and get married. Systematics came to us and said, we've got a big problem in Los Angeles, Imperial Bank. Would you do that system? And could you have it ready by 1st of February? And we said yes, and wrote that system. And Imperial Bank then became a good customer for probably 7 years. And we did a lot of interesting things for them, and they ran 400 or 500 escrow and trust companies on it, both in Southern California from a Los Angeles data center and in Northern California from a San Francisco data center. Slightly after that, during the Imperial project, while we were pretty much impossibly busy, IBM came to us with Banquet Foods. And Banquet Foods was going to get the first IBM System 34 in Arkansas, and they were going to run a distributed system with Batesville, Arkansas, Jefferson City, Missouri, Livonia, Georgia. The Banquet headquarters in St. Louis was going to be connected, and the RCA headquarters in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. The RCA owned Banquet at the time. So big data communications network, and they needed poultry software. And from OK, they'd gotten my name. So we were signed up to do the first System 34 in the state. And we told them we could do it if the computer came in at such and such a time. And otherwise it would have been tough for us. But the computer got delayed, and we were doing the poultry stuff, and Banquet was going to do the data communication stuff, and they were going to go live, I guess, January 1st of 1979, and turned out they didn't have any of the data communication stuff done. So they dumped that on us at the last minute, and we became expert in System 34 data communications, and had this multi-site thing with Banquet, and did one more sale of the Banquet of the poultry software. We installed it in Venezuela with Ralston Purina. So our one of our first international things was still chickens, and Banquet turned out to be the way we went from chickens and seeds and VA hospitals to ATMs and banking networks. Turned out to be a real important thing. The same time we were doing that, doing the Banquet stuff, we were doing accounting systems on microcomputers, and James and Eugene did that. And they ended up with 700 customers around the country. That was before the IBM PC, before MS-DOS, very early. And if we'd been more understanding of how to bring in capital, we might have made a pretty good company out of that. The other thing that happened is by the time we got to the late 70s, we were up to more than 10 people, between 10 and 20 people. And my thing about operations came up again. I was good at new things. I was good at making things out of nothing, but tough for me to make things just run on time. And James and I had found that out with the VA project. The VA people had lots of things they wanted in the system. When I was in charge of it, we put in all those new things, and they got new features and functions, and that was great, except the reports that were supposed to be run the first of the month got run the 10th or the 11th of the month. When James took it over, not so many new features, but it ran just perfectly. It was, the reports were done when the reports were supposed to be done. And so in 1978 or 79, I decided I wasn't a good person to be the president, and I fired myself. And Bruce was president for an interim period, and then James Hendren became the president, and pretty much that was it for the growth of Arkansas Systems. We had me doing things that I did well, James doing things that he did much better than me. So we built up people, still selling these things oddly one at a time. In 1980, we got a call from IBM not to do a system, but come do a little consulting. They had a large customer, Worthen Bank, that had many correspondent banks around Arkansas, and they processed all those banks on their computer here in Little Rock. So that meant that you had to have a courier system that went out across the state, go out at night, pick up all the checks, pick up new account forms, bring them in, enter the data, which was messy and prone to errors, run the stuff, and then print out tons of reports, and then take those reports back to Batesville, to Van Buren, to Searcy, to wherever their correspondent banks were. And they wanted to get out of the messier parts of that business. So IBM had convinced them that they could put System 34s out at these correspondent banks, and that they could do data entry, they could do their new accounts, they could have a balance file that Worthen transmitted to them, so they could do lookups during the day, post to that balance file, memo post to it, and then send in everything electronically at the end of the day. And Worthen could do that, send out the balance files and other reports, and they could be printed then locally on those System 34. So that's sort of a version of remote job entry. And that was what we had done for Banquet Foods to their headquarters in St. Louis and their super headquarters in New Jersey. So we had that expertise. So IBM called us and said, turned out to be me. He said, John, can you come in and do a few hours of consulting and show us how to set up RJE to do all this stuff? And then I came in to do that. And at that point, they intended to write all the software themselves, or have a IBM systems engineer to write all of that code. And they just needed this little technical thing done. So I came in, took about a couple hours to do that. And then I found out that they had this problem with the ATMs. And fairly sure of myself, I said, well, we could do that. We could connect those ATMs for you. And they said, well, we've been all over the country and people have said they can't do it, that they have to put in another computer, an IBM Series 1 in front of the System 34 to manage the ATMs, because these Diebold ATMs are IBM 32, they are 3270 terminal emulators, and the System 34 doesn't support 3270 terminals. It's BiSync, so yeah, the 34's got BiSync, but it's 3780 BiSync. It's useful for RJE and similar things, and somehow, pretty much on the moment, I said, well, I'm sure we could do that. And I was thinking a couple things. One, I was thinking that I'd learned that you could. The big differences between the two protocols were that you had to address. There was an address on the start of the transmission for 3270. You had to say the terminal's name because there were many terminals on the line. And I knew that there was an option that was unused on the 34 to put that address out there, and that would work. And then sending data to the ATM would just naturally happen. But there was another thing that had to happen, which was called polling, where the mainframe computer would say, Terminal A, you got anything for me? And it would either say no or yes. And that was not in the capabilities of the BiSync on the System 34. Selecting and sending was okay, polling wasn't. And so I thought, that's real close though. It's just a little change. So we could do the same thing we did for the Corps of Engineers. We could modify the operating system's object modules. And somehow I thought all of that right at that moment, and I told them we could do it. And they went back to IBM, and IBM said, you can't do it. And I told them what I thought we would do. And they said, maybe. And they referred to the lab, and the lab kept saying, yeah, but that's not nice. Can't do it. And Diebold said, you can't do it. And somehow we convinced IBM Worthen here that we could do it in spite of all that. And that if they brought 5 banks in, we could do it for a fixed price for each of those banks. And we were able to do it using stuff that we knew. And then over time, IBM decided that it was just, and Worthen decided that it was easier to have us write the central information code and all the other code on the System 34. So we ended up pretty much doing all of it for those 5 banks. And then the question was, how do we got 5 banks, can we do more than that? And so we let IBM, we did press releases. We did a set of press releases in Computer World. First one that just vaguely alluded to what we were doing. And that got other vendors like Bunker Ramo that made teller terminals. They came down and looked at the bank in Batesville, had makers of other kinds of ATMs come and visit us. And by that time, these banks were not doing what Worthen intended that they do. Other banks were just installing the System 34 and using software that, interestingly enough, came from Arkansas, from Grant County Bank, and so we were installing with EDS, we were installing with Horizon, with many software vendors eventually, but it was all fairly easy. And the other thing that had happened was, as banks were starting to put in that banking software, they needed conversions, and we ended up being the go-to people to write the code to convert from the one file format to the new System 34 file format. So we were in touch with all the banking vendors. We were in touch with IBM, and pretty shortly, NCR and DocuTel and Bunker Ramo and Burroughs all came to us. Really had something pretty exciting. We got some business from IBM in the Caribbean and NCR, and I in the Caribbean did an overseas project in Trinidad, and then other islands. Did Bank of Nova Scotia, which had banks in 20 different Caribbean countries. So it all really grew. We brought in these people, and someplace in there it started to shift towards international quicker than Systematics. We ended up being international. Even when they did a sale to American Express, it was going to be installed in Germany to support military banking. We had people go on site, and they didn't. And we were doing these projects all around the country. It built up this customer base of hundreds and hundreds of community banks. And then a thing that we couldn't control happened. Under the Reagan and Bush administrations, they changed the banking law, and they allowed interstate branches. They allowed a lot of mergers and acquisitions of banks. And so things started happening. Worthen itself became Boatman's Bank, and then Bank of America. Many of our community banks ceased to exist as they got bought up. So our U.S. customer base of community banks was declining. And so we were fortunate in that the middle 80s, we started doing more international stuff. First in the Caribbean, a little bit in Latin America, Bolivia, Central America, like we did a national network in Honduras, and national network in Bolivia, a ATM system in Colombia. A lot of that. Those came pretty easily. IBM sent us PT Sigma from Indonesia, and I went and spent pretty close to a month with them, because we worked not just on technical stuff, but on how you do sales and how you run a business, how you start a software company. So I've got a plaque on my wall that says I'm the grandfather of one of PT Sigma's efforts. But they brought us 30 banks. We had 30 systems in Indonesia, and then we had sales in China and other places too in Asia. Europe was the hard one. IBM Europe felt they had an ATM vendor, and they were in Paris. And so their comment was, why would we go to Little Rock when we can go to Paris? And we didn't have any other way to break into that. But NCR remembered us, and NCR in Turkey had an opportunity to sell 40 ATMs to a bank that was going to run an AS400. And IBM told them, no way could that AS400 run the NCR ATMs. So NCR Turkey paid us to come over and demonstrate that we could make their ATMs communicate with AS400. James and I had different opinions. James felt like it was a risk to go to Europe. It was much more sophisticated infrastructure than in Central America and the Caribbean or the fringes of Asia. And I thought we were we could get business. I thought we could sell it. So we made a deal, which was I paid my own ticket to Germany to present, and the company paid my expenses while I was there. And we went in, and I went in, and they say, we'll give you 30 minutes. And at the end of 30 minutes, I guess basically they said, we don't like you. We would rather deal with Paris than Little Rock, but you got 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, they said, two of us need to talk to you more. So we went and we did another presentation in more detail. And at the end of that, they decided that we did things that they didn't do in Paris. And we started getting business. Got first customer in Russia, and then we found a good partner, Polygon Systems in Hungary, and went there. And we ended up with a lot of ATMs in Eastern Europe, including some for a company that started in Kansas City called Euronet Worldwide that was working in Hungary. And they became our customer. And that led to not only growth, but eventual merger. But during that period, we went from a period in the late 1980s where 90% of our business was community banks in the U.S. to where 10 years later, 90% of our business was larger banks globally. And by that time, we had offices had people in Asia Pacific and people in an office in Hungary. So big change, and I think maybe one of the more interesting things that we did was become a global company in that short period of time. And we worked pretty hard at that because we'd had people that had never been outside the U.S. And we brought in some professors from UA Little Rock, and we did cultural awareness courses. And I think that helped. And I think the fact that we brought people in and found out that they were just people, that we could get along, and that, in fact, if they were banking people, ATM people, they were more like us than our neighbors in that respect, who didn't understand any of the stuff that we did. The merger turned out to be a really good fit. Interesting enough, we were acquired, but we had the longer track record. We were 23 years old at the time we were acquired, and Euronet's corporate culture wasn't as mature as ours. And Mike Brown has told me since then that part of what happened was our corporate culture took over. And so how you treated people, how you treated customers, how you did key things, much of that came from Arkansas Systems and Euronet. And Euronet's done many, many acquisitions. They're a multi-billion-dollar company now. And the Arkansas Systems part of it is Euronet Software Solutions, which still employs the same number of people in Little Rock as when we did the merger. I would say it's one of the happier mergers ever. If I go to the website in 2024, look at what Euronet Software Solutions puts up as their executive team, at least half of the 10 people are people that were important in Arkansas Systems at the time we did the merger. We certainly lost senior management and vice presidents that went on to do other things, but it's been a progression so that the person that's in charge of Euronet Software Solutions now was a project manager when we did the merger. So we had good people. They still have good people, and an amazing number of them are the same folks. I've done eventually, pretty much everything I even thought about doing when I was 10 or 11 years old. One of the stories of Arkansas Systems that I didn't tell was I did a summer sabbatical in the 80s and worked for NASA, um, and did data communication stuff for them. I started going on boards. I was on the Arkansas Community Foundation board. I was Arkansas trustee of the Nature Conservancy, and I still am. I was the founding chairman of a company called icobo.com that did remittance processing. And we never had a lot of money invested, but we did go from friends and family rounds to Wall Street funded round that ended in 2008 with the financial collapse. But we were more or less a competitor of PayPal's, and early on we had more countries than PayPal. We did business, iCobo did business in 192 countries and all 7 continents. Did fund transfers from Antarctica, which is a hard continent to get to. I have traveled to all the continents as a tourist, Antarctica and Australia, and for business every place else. For the last 10 years, I've worked one way or another in entrepreneurship ecosystem. And lots of stuff exists now. In the 70s, you just had to find people to talk to, and there was no defined process. Now there's a lot of really well-defined process and a big ecosystem. I'd advise somebody to get into that ecosystem, to visit entrepreneurial support organizations, wherever they are. In Little Rock, that's the Venture Center. There's different ones in Conway, Northwest Arkansas, or wherever you were. If you're on a university campus, there's parts of the university that are aimed at new ventures. And those things put you through a methodical path, often using customer discovery and the lean canvas methodology that National Science Foundation started. I've had about, turns out, 20 to 30 years of working with the National Science Foundation, either on advisory panels or in their I-Corps entrepreneurship program. And I helped start a thing in Arkansas called the I-Fund that followed that pattern and taught in it for 6 or 7 years, hundreds of companies. But I think the process helps you define things that we stumbled our way to. What's the problem you're solving? What's your value to your customers? Who are your customers? What is your solution? How do all those fit together? What are your channels to go to the market? What are your costs? Where your revenues come from? And that there's a model you go through, and a really nice process. And getting mentoring is really helpful. I had the people at Systematics, even when they didn't think they were mentoring me, were. Other people were at other times. Our landlord did. But I think mentors are real important, and following some kind of a process.